Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. The research station's soft hum filled the room as Mark Winters meticulously cataloged the latest samples from a Threnan genetic study. Across the lab, Cryana was seated at her workstation, her scaled fingers hovering hesitantly over the hollow interface. She had been unusually quiet all day, her vibrant golden scales dimmer than usual. "Cryana, is something bothering you?" Mark asked, setting his datapad aside. Cryana's vertical pupils flicked toward him, her jaw tightening. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of brushing off his concern, but then she exhaled, a low, almost musical rumble. "There is something I wish to discuss," she said, her voice as deliberate and precise as always, but laced with hesitation. Mark pulled up a stool and sat across from her. "You know you can tell me anything." Her crest flushed faintly, a Threnan equivalent to a human blush. "Among my kind there is a tradition, a breeding pact. It is more than reproduction. It is a bond, an ultimate union of trust and intimacy." Mark nodded, intrigued but sensing the weight of her words. "And you're considering this?" "I am," she said, her voice soft. "But there are complications. My biology is not accustomed to such acts with your kind, and even within my own species, it can be painful." Mark's brows furrowed. "Have you spoken to anyone about this? Other Threnans or medical experts?" "I have," Cryana admitted. "But Threnan medics treat it as a personal failing, something to overcome through sheer will. It is difficult." Mark's heart ached for her. He had grown to admire her strength, intelligence, and the vulnerability she rarely showed. "You don't have to go through this alone, Cry. If this is something you want, I'll do whatever I can to make it easier for you." Her gaze softened, and she leaned forward slightly, her scaled hand resting briefly on his. "Your willingness means more to me than you can know." Their conversation was interrupted by an incoming transmission from the station's central AI. A delegation of Threnan officials was due to visit in 2 weeks, a reminder of the precarious political situation surrounding their relationship. As Cryana returned to her work, Mark found himself grappling with the enormity of what she had shared. He resolved to study everything he could about Threnan biology and cultural traditions, determined to support Cryana no matter the challenges ahead. That night, as the artificial day cycle dimmed the lights in the station, Mark couldn't help but wonder, could love truly bridge such a vast divide? And would Cryana find the courage to face the pain of intimacy for the connection they both yearned for? Mark's quarters were dimly lit, a holographic representation of a serene earth forest projected across the walls. It was his refuge aboard the sterile, metal-clad research station. Yet tonight, peace eluded him. His mind churned with thoughts of Cryana's revelation and the challenges ahead. At the center of his desk was a datapad filled with research on Threnan physiology, intimate bonding rituals, and medical studies addressing cross-species interactions. He had barely scratched the surface. The complexity of Threnan neural pathways and their heightened pain receptors posed significant hurdles to physical intimacy, let alone the deep emotional vulnerability Cryana yearned for. He rubbed his temples. "No pressure, Mark. Just solve interspecies intimacy overnight." Still, he couldn't abandon the idea. Cryana deserved more than his effort. She deserved understanding. He dove back into the text, hoping for answers. Meanwhile, Cryana sat in her meditation chamber. The room, designed for Threnan cultural practices, was a sanctuary of smooth, reflective surfaces and low-frequency vibrations that resonated with her scales. But tonight, the vibrations failed to calm her. Her claws rested on her lap, trembling slightly. What had possessed her to confess such a deeply personal struggle to Mark? She admired his kindness, his unwavering curiosity, and his capacity to adapt. Yet she feared burdening him with her inadequacies. Cryana's people viewed the breeding pact as sacred, a union where 2 souls intertwined as deeply as their bodies. But for her, the physical act had always been marred by pain, a barrier she couldn't overcome alone. Her musings were interrupted by the chime of her communication console. She hesitated before answering. "Cryana," came the gruff voice of Threnek, her elder mentor and one of the Threnan officials visiting soon. "I trust your preparations for the delegation are progressing." "They are, Elder," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Good. Remember, our people see you as a representative of Threnan strength and tradition. Your association with the human is unconventional. Be cautious in your dealings." "I will honor our traditions," Cryana said, though her chest tightened. Threnek's image flickered off, leaving her alone once more. She clenched her jaw. Her people demanded strength, yet here she was, relying on a human to navigate her most personal struggle. The following day, Mark found Cryana in the station's arboretum. The artificial habitat was filled with earth flora, its humid air a modest compromise for Cryana's desert-dwelling preferences. She was seated beneath a flowering tree, her tail coiled neatly around her. "Cry," he called softly, careful not to startle her. She looked up, her golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. "Mark, you have been researching," he chuckled, holding up his datapad. "Guilty as charged. Threnan biology is fascinating and challenging. But I think I've found something that might help." She gestured for him to sit beside her. "Tell me." "There's a method humans use in trauma therapy, gradual exposure combined with physical desensitization. It's about taking small steps, focusing on building trust and reducing discomfort over time. Maybe we can adapt that for this?" Cryana tilted her head, her crest rising slightly in interest. "You propose we practice?" "Not in the traditional sense," Mark clarified, his cheeks reddening. "But yes, starting with smaller forms of contact and working toward greater intimacy if you're comfortable." She considered his words carefully. "It is a logical approach. And I trust you, Mark." Her admission warmed him, but it also deepened his resolve. "We'll take it one step at a time. No pressure. Just let me know if anything feels wrong or overwhelming." Their first session began later that evening. In Mark's quarters, they set clear boundaries. No expectations, no judgments, and the freedom for either to stop at any time. Cryana sat on the edge of Mark's couch, her posture tense. Mark started by holding out his hand. "May I?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then extended her own. Her claws brushed against his palm, her scales cool and smooth to the touch. He closed his fingers around hers, applying the lightest pressure. "How does this feel?" "Strange," she admitted. "But not unpleasant." He smiled. "That's a good start." For several minutes, they held hands, speaking about lighter topics to ease the tension. Gradually, Mark introduced small variations, moving his thumb along her knuckles, adjusting his grip slightly. Each action was met with her careful observation and occasional questions. By the end of the session, Cryana's shoulders had relaxed, and her crest flushed a soft, reassuring green. "I had not realized how comforting touch could be," she said quietly. Mark's chest tightened with a mix of relief and affection. "We'll keep building on this. One step at a time." Unbeknownst to them, rumors of their relationship had begun circulating among the station's crew. While most dismissed it as idle gossip, a few viewed their growing bond with suspicion or outright hostility. One such individual was Lieutenant Harris, a human security officer known for his conservative views. He intercepted Mark in the mess hall the next morning. "Winters," Harris said, his tone sharp. "Word around the station is you're getting a little too close to the Threnan." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." "It becomes my business when it threatens the station's reputation. People are watching you, Winters. Don't forget that." Mark stared him down. "What Cry and I do is between us. If you've got a problem, take it up with command." Harris scowled but said nothing further, stalking away. The encounter left Mark unsettled, but it only strengthened his resolve. Cryana had trusted him with her vulnerability, and he wouldn't let anyone undermine that. That evening, their next session focused on proximity. Sitting closer, sharing space, and gradually introducing touch beyond the hands. Cryana's discomfort flared briefly but subsided as Mark reassured her with his patience and calm demeanor. As their connection deepened, so did the challenges. Cryana's fears weren't just physical. They were woven into her identity as a Threnan, shaped by years of cultural expectation and personal insecurity. But for every moment of doubt, there were breakthroughs, small but significant. A shared laugh. A touch that lingered a little longer. And the growing realization that intimacy was about more than overcoming pain, it was about creating something new together. As the 2-week mark approached and the Threnan delegation loomed, Cryana found herself reflecting on her journey. The breeding pact was still a daunting prospect, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. And with Mark by her side, she dared to believe they could bridge the divide between their worlds and themselves. The research station hummed with activity as preparations for the Threnan delegation intensified. Cryana and Mark found themselves with little privacy as both species officials buzzed around, ensuring everything would go seamlessly. However, the weight of scrutiny hung heavily over them, especially with the unspoken judgment from their colleagues. Mark stood in the station's medbay, reviewing data on the holodisplay. The latest simulations on Threnan pain receptors and sensory thresholds flickered in front of him. A breakthrough could help Cryana, but time was running short. "Still working on that?" Dr. Alyssa Greaves, the station's human medical officer, stepped into the room. Mark turned, smiling faintly. Yeah, it's important. Alyssa folded her arms, her expression cautious. Important professionally or personally? Mark hesitated. He trusted Alyssa, but the stakes of his and Cryana's relationship made transparency a gamble. Both, he said finally. Cryana's struggling with something deeply personal, and I want to help her. Alyssa studied him for a moment before nodding. You're a good man, Mark. But be careful. Not everyone sees things the way you do. Mark exhaled. I know. And that's their problem. Alyssa sighed but didn't push further. If you need medical insight, let me know. Just watch your back. Cryana, meanwhile, was enduring her own challenges. The Threnan delegation's impending arrival had brought a surge of communications from her people. Most messages were formal inquiries about logistics, but a few, particularly from Threnek, were thinly veiled warnings. You are representing more than yourself, Threnek had said in their latest conversation. The eyes of Threnan leadership will be upon you. Your connection to the human is an anomaly, not a standard to aspire to. The words stung, but Cryana refused to let them shake her resolve. She couldn't ignore the unique bond she shared with Mark, nor the progress they'd made together. Still, doubt lingered like a shadow in the corners of her mind. That evening, Mark and Cryana met in the Arboretum for their next session. The environment was dim, the soft glow of bioluminescent plants casting calming light around them. How are you holding up? Mark asked as they settled on a low bench surrounded by ferns. Cryana's crest flicked with subtle tension. The delegation brings much expectation. I fear my bond with you will be viewed as a weakness. Mark frowned. Your bond with me isn't a weakness, Cry. It's proof that trust and understanding can exist between our species. That's something worth fighting for. Her golden eyes softened and she nodded. Your faith gives me strength. Tonight's session focused on proximity and touch as before, but Mark introduced a new element, communication without words. He gently guided her hand to his chest, letting her feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. This is how humans express comfort and connection, he said. It's simple but meaningful. Cryana's hand lingered, her claws resting lightly against his skin. It is reassuring. A reminder of life. Encouraged, Mark placed his hand over hers. And it's mutual. I can feel your warmth, your strength. For several minutes they remained like that, their silence speaking volumes. The gap between their worlds felt smaller, the barriers less insurmountable. The following day the delegation arrived. The Threnan officials were a commanding presence, their imposing forms clad in ceremonial armor. Threnek led the group, his scales a deep obsidian, his eyes sharp and calculating. Cryana, he said, inclining his head slightly. You have done well to prepare the station for our visit. Thank you, Elder, Cryana replied, her tone respectful but guarded. Threnek's gaze shifted to Mark, who stood beside her. And this is the human you work so closely with? Mark extended a hand, offering a polite smile. Mark Winters. It's an honor to meet you. Threnek eyed the gesture but did not reciprocate. You are the xenobiologist, yes? I trust your work with Cryana has been productive. It has, Mark said evenly. We've made significant progress in understanding Threnan biology and cultural practices. Good, Threnek said, though his tone suggested skepticism. As the delegation moved on, Mark exchanged a glance with Cryana. The tension was palpable, but they couldn't let it deter them. That night, the station held a formal reception for the delegation. The event was a blend of human and Threnan customs, featuring an array of foods, music, and ceremonial displays. Mark stood near the edge of the room, watching as Cryana navigated the crowd with her usual poise. She was stunning, her golden scales shimmering under the soft lights. You've got it bad, Alyssa said, sidling up beside him. Mark chuckled, not bothering to deny it. She's worth it. As if sensing his gaze, Cryana turned and made her way toward him. You are not enjoying the festivities? She asked, her tone teasing. I'm enjoying the view, he replied with a grin. Her crest flushed a faint green and she tilted her head. You are bold, Mark Winters. Before he could respond, a commotion drew their attention. Lieutenant Harris was arguing with one of the Threnan delegates, his voice rising. This is ridiculous, Harris said. We're bending over backward for these people, and they treat us like we're beneath them. Threnek stepped forward, his posture imposing. Your attitude is unbecoming of your station, Lieutenant. Harris sneered. And your kind's arrogance is unbecoming of a supposed ally. Mark moved to intervene, but Cryana placed a hand on his arm. Let him dig his own grave, she murmured. Threnek regarded Harris coldly. If this is the caliber of human diplomacy, perhaps we overestimated your species. The room fell silent. Mark stepped forward, addressing both men. With all due respect, this isn't the time for posturing. We're here to build bridges, not burn them. Threnek's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. Wise words. Perhaps you could teach your colleague restraint? Harris stormed out, leaving an awkward tension in his wake. Later, Mark and Cryana retreated to the Arboretum to escape the chaos. Your defense of me was appreciated, Cryana said, her voice soft. Always, Mark replied. We're in this together, Cry. She hesitated, then reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I am grateful for your presence, even in the face of adversity. Mark covered her hand with his own. And I'm grateful for yours. We'll get through this. One step at a time. As the artificial night cycle dimmed the station's lights, they sat together in quiet solidarity, their bond growing stronger with each passing challenge. The station buzzed with tension the morning after the reception. News of Lieutenant Harris's outburst had spread, leaving ripples of unease among both humans and Threnans. Mark could feel the weight of disapproving eyes on him as he moved through the corridors. The whispering, the glances, he knew they were directed at him and Cryana. In the research lab, Cryana was already working, her golden scales catching the light from the holographic displays. Despite her composed demeanor, Mark could see the tightness in her posture. Morning, Cry, he greeted softly, setting his data pad on the workstation. She looked up, her crest flicking in acknowledgement. Morning, Mark. You seem troubled? He hesitated. It's the fallout from last night. People are talking. Her gaze sharpened. About us? Yeah. Cryana's jaw tightened, her claws flexing against the desk. Our bond is our own. Their judgment is irrelevant. Mark admired her strength, but he knew the scrutiny affected her, even if she wouldn't admit it. We'll handle it together like we always do. She nodded, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. Later that day, the Threnan delegation called an unexpected meeting. Representatives from both species gathered in the station's central chamber, the air thick with anticipation. Threnek stood at the center, his imposing form radiating authority. The purpose of this gathering is to discuss the viability of deeper alliances between our peoples. To that end, we require a demonstration of trust. Mark exchanged a wary glance with Cryana. What kind of demonstration? Asked Commander Harlow, the station's human leader. Threnek gestured toward Cryana. Cryana and the human scientist Mark Winters have formed a bond that defies traditional norms. We propose a trial to test the strength of their connection, a symbolic gesture of unity. Mark felt his stomach tighten. What kind of trial? Threnek's gaze shifted to him, unyielding. A challenge that mirrors the breeding pact. It will require physical endurance, emotional vulnerability, and complete trust between participants. Murmurs rippled through the room. That's highly irregular, Commander Harlow said. And potentially dangerous. The trial is voluntary, Threnek replied, his tone cool. But if successful, it would serve as a powerful symbol of what our species can achieve together. Mark turned to Cryana. What do you think? She regarded him with a mixture of resolve and apprehension. The trial is not meant to harm, but it will test us. If we succeed, it could strengthen our bond and silence our detractors. Mark nodded, his decision made. We'll do it. Preparations for the trial began immediately. The challenge involved navigating a holographic simulation designed to replicate the harsh environments of Threnan homeworlds, with additional elements tailored to test psychological and physical coordination. Mark and Cryana spent hours reviewing the parameters. The simulation would require them to rely on each other to overcome obstacles, pushing them to their limits. As they prepared, Alyssa visited the lab. You're really going through with this? She asked, concern etched on her face. Mark nodded. It's a chance to prove that what Cry and I have is real, and that our species can work together. Alyssa sighed. Just, don't push yourself too hard. And watch out for each other. The trial took place in a vast chamber converted into a holographic simulation. Representatives from both species watched from an observation deck, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Mark and Cryana stood side by side at the starting platform. The environment shimmered to life around them, transforming into a rugged desert landscape under a scorching sun. Ready? Mark asked, glancing at Cryana. She nodded, her crest rising slightly. Together. The first obstacle was a series of rocky outcrops that required precise coordination to traverse. Mark led the way, his human agility compensating for the uneven terrain, while Cryana used her powerful tail for balance. They communicated with subtle gestures and words, their synergy improving with each step. As they reached the top, the environment shifted, plunging them into a dark, subterranean cavern. The air was heavy, the path ahead obscured by shadows. "This part tests trust," Cryana said. "One of us must lead." Mark held out his hand. "I'll go first. Just stay close." She hesitated briefly before placing her hand in his. They moved cautiously through the darkness, Mark using his senses to guide them while Cryana remained attuned to the subtle vibrations around them. Halfway through, a sudden tremor shook the cavern. Rocks tumbled from above, and Cryana yanked Mark out of harm's way just in time. "Thanks," he said, his heart racing. "Always," she replied, her grip on his arm firm. The final stage of the trial brought them to a wide chasm with a single narrow bridge spanning the void. Below, simulated magma churned, emitting waves of heat. Mark took a deep breath. "No room for error here. We will cross together," Cryana said firmly. They stepped onto the bridge, moving in perfect unison. Halfway across, the structure began to sway violently, testing their balance and composure. "Don't look down," Mark said, gripping Cryana's hand tightly. "I am not afraid of heights," she replied, her voice steady. With a final surge of effort, they reached the other side. As their feet touched solid ground, the simulation dissolved, returning the chamber to its original state. Cheers erupted from the observation deck, though not all faces looked pleased. Thrennic, however, inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Back in the arboretum, Mark and Cryana sat in exhausted silence, the glow of victory tempered by the weight of the experience. "You were incredible," Mark said finally. "As were you," Cryana replied, her voice soft. "We succeeded because we relied on each other." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "That's what trust is about." She turned her hand, allowing their fingers to interlace. "You have shown me that trust is not a weakness but a strength." As the station's night cycle dimmed the lights, they remained together, the bond between them stronger than ever. The aftermath of the trial left Mark and Cryana in a moment of fragile triumph. Their success had silenced some of their critics, but the tension between the two species had not fully dissipated. The victory was symbolic, a milestone in a long journey that neither of them could predict the outcome of. Still, as they sat together in the dim light of the station's arboretum, the weight of their bond and the weight of the expectations placed upon them was palpable. "Do you think they'll ever accept us?" Mark asked, his voice low, filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had watched the delegation, particularly Thrennic, carefully during the trial. While the elder had acknowledged their success, it had been through a veneer of indifference, the kind of gaze that marked an outsider as a curiosity rather than an ally. Cryana, her golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the bioluminescent plants around them, exhaled slowly. "Some will never accept us," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But some may. Our success in the trial was not enough to change all hearts, but it has opened some minds." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup in her hands, before looking at him again. "And for me that is enough, for now." Mark nodded, his hand brushing against hers. "For now," he echoed. It wasn't just the pressure of their public bond that weighed on him. There was something more, a growing sense that their connection was becoming more complicated, more fragile, the closer they got. As their bond deepened, the intricacies of their differences seemed to loom larger. The next day, Mark returned to his research with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the desire to understand more about Cryana's species and how he could better support her. The holographic simulations had revealed much, but there was still so much he didn't understand about Threnan biology, especially the emotional and psychological impact of their unique physiology. He was startled from his thoughts when the door to his lab slid open. Cryana entered, her posture more rigid than usual. She had a datapad in hand, its screen flashing with several incoming communications. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, immediately sensing the shift in her demeanor. "I received a message," she said, her voice low and tight. "From Thrennic?" Mark frowned. "What does it say?" Cryana hesitated before handing him the datapad. Mark scanned the message quickly, the words striking him like a slap. It was a formal request for a private meeting, not just with Cryana but with both her and Mark present. The tone was businesslike, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of pressure in the phrasing. "They want us to prove ourselves further," Mark said slowly. "A test of some kind?" "Yes," Cryana replied, her voice strained. "Thrennic has suggested that our bond is not enough. He wants to see more. He wants to see if we are truly worthy of being allies. Of being together. Mark glanced up at her, confused. But we passed the trial, didn't we? Cryanna's gaze hardened. Yes. But that was symbolic. A formality. He believes our connection is too fragile. That it will not endure, that it is nothing more than a fleeting curiosity. Mark felt his heart sink. What does he want us to do? What's the next test? Cryanna looked away, her eyes distant as if weighing the impact of her next words. He is asking us to endure a full breeding pact. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's heart raced. The breeding pact, to Cryanna's species, was a deeply sacred and profound bond. It went far beyond mere physical intimacy. It was the ultimate demonstration of trust and union, a bond that, once made, could not be undone. It was considered the highest form of commitment, and its significance could not be overstated. This is what he's asking? Mark finally managed, his voice hoarse. For us to go through the full ritual? Cryanna nodded, her face a mixture of sadness and resignation. Yes. And I fear that if we do not comply, Thrennic and others will never accept our connection. We will always be seen as a failed experiment. Something that can never last. Mark's mind was spinning. The idea of the breeding pact was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The thought of it made him nervous, even fearful, yet there was something in Cryanna's expression that calmed him. She wasn't asking for this out of desperation or manipulation. It was a matter of survival, for both of them. I don't know if I can do it, Mark confessed. I don't want to hurt you. Cryanna's eyes softened. You will not hurt me, Mark. Not if we are careful. But we must be open to each other. We must push through what frightens us. His throat tightened. He had never expected their relationship to reach this point, not this quickly, not with the weight of an entire species' expectations hanging over them. But as he looked into Cryanna's eyes, he saw nothing but sincerity. She wasn't asking for this because of pressure from others. She was asking because she truly believed in their connection, and that was something Mark could no longer ignore. We'll do it, he said, his voice firm. But we do this together. No matter what happens. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Cryanna took Mark aside to explain more about the breeding pact ritual. It wasn't just a physical act, it was a sacred process, one that required both mental and emotional openness. She spoke of Threnan customs and what the breeding pact meant for her people, their deepest expression of trust, of unity. For Mark it was both terrifying and humbling. He realized that this wasn't just about him and Cryanna, it was about both of their species. If they failed, it would send a message not only to Thrennic but to the entire Threnan delegation. That night, Mark lay in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. The weight of their decision pressed heavily on him. How could he, a human, truly be ready to step into such an intimate and sacred ritual with someone so different, yet so undeniably important to him? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of Cryanna's voice, coming through his calm link. Mark, are you ready? He let out a long breath, his mind still racing. As ready as I'll ever be. Her words came again, quieter this time. Then let us face this together as we always have. As Mark made his way to the designated chamber, he felt his nerves coil tighter. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he trusted Cryanna, and that was all that mattered now. When he entered, Cryanna stood waiting for him, her body adorned in the ceremonial markings of her people. The soft glow of the chamber illuminated her in a way he had never seen before. In that moment, he realized that despite all the differences between their species, they had already formed something beautiful and powerful together. A bond that no test, no ritual could ever diminish. We do this together, he whispered, his voice steady. Her eyes met his, filled with resolve. Together. And so they stepped forward, not knowing where the ritual would take them, but certain that they would face it side by side. The chamber was vast, the walls lined with soft, undulating lights that cast gentle shadows across the floor. It was designed for moments like this, sacred, intimate, and unyielding in its solemnity. The air hummed with a quiet energy, a tangible reminder of the weight of tradition that hung over them. Mark stood in the center, his mind swirling with uncertainty, but his resolve, tempered by Cryanna's presence, remained steady. Cryanna moved to stand beside him, her golden scales gleaming under the ambient light, her form even more majestic in the ceremonial markings she now wore. The intricate designs along her arms and legs signified her readiness for the breeding pact. Mark had seen the markings before, but never in this context. They were more than decorative. They symbolized a union, a commitment to something far greater than the two of them. This is it, she whispered, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Are you sure? Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt more vulnerable, more exposed, yet more certain of the path before him. The ritual, which seemed so alien, now felt like an undeniable part of his journey with Cryana. I'm sure. We're in this together. Cryana gave a small nod, her expression calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her gaze. It was the same look she had given him during the trial, an expression of quiet strength, a trust that they would be able to navigate whatever came next. The elders had left them alone in the chamber for now, their part in the ritual symbolic but separate. Thrennic's message had been clear. The trial had only been the beginning. For this union to be recognized, for their bond to truly become something that would unite their species, they would have to prove it through this deeply personal act. It wasn't just about crossing boundaries or sharing a physical space, it was about a raw, undiluted connection that transcended everything they had previously known. Tell me more about this ritual, Mark said, his voice breaking the silence between them. Cryana turned to him, her golden eyes locking onto his. The breeding pact is a sacred bond in my culture. It is not just a promise of union but a promise of shared strength and trust. It is an act that transcends the physical. The bond that is forged in this ritual binds us emotionally, spiritually, and physically. There will be pain, but the pain is not meant to hurt us. It is meant to deepen our connection, to prove that we are strong enough to endure together. When the ritual is complete, we will both carry the mark of our union. That mark will last forever and it will be visible to our people. No one will be able to deny that we belong together. Mark absorbed her words carefully, feeling the weight of what she was saying settle in. The idea of such an intimate, sacred commitment was daunting. Yet, in Cryana's eyes, there was nothing but sincerity. Her words weren't a plea, they were an invitation, to share something that could not be undone. Is it always painful? Mark asked, his voice low. She gave a small, rueful smile. For Threnins, yes. But we endure. We grow stronger because of it. The pain is not something to fear, it is simply part of the process of becoming one with another. Mark swallowed hard, uncertain but willing. And for me? He asked, the question hanging in the air. How will it affect me? Cryana's gaze softened, her fingers brushing against his. Your body is not made for this, but it is stronger than you know. The connection will draw on both of us equally. You will feel the pain as I do, but you will also feel the strength, the bond that grows with every moment we share. Together, we will be bound not just by the ritual but by everything we've shared up to this point. Mark nodded slowly, unsure of how his body would respond, but certain that his heart was ready. He had come to trust Cryana in ways he had never imagined, and that trust gave him the courage to step forward, even into the unknown. Without another word, Cryana took a step closer, placing her hand gently against his chest. The warmth of her touch sent a shiver through him, an electric pulse that seemed to reverberate through every fiber of his being. The physical connection was subtle but undeniable, as if their bodies had known each other long before this moment. I am ready, she whispered, her voice soft but resolute. Mark looked into her eyes, seeing a flicker of vulnerability beneath the calm exterior. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. Then let's do this. The ritual began with a soft hum, the energy in the chamber shifting as Cryana activated the first phase of the breeding pact. The floor beneath them glowed faintly, and the walls shimmered with the ethereal presence of ancient symbols, long forgotten by most but known intimately by the Threnin people. It was a reminder of the deep ancestral roots of their species, a connection that reached back through time. Cryana raised her arms, her body moving with the fluid grace of her kind. The markings along her arms began to glow faintly, a soft blue light that pulsed in rhythm with her breathing. She closed her eyes, drawing in a deep breath as if preparing herself for the moment to come. The quiet energy in the room intensified, and Mark could feel it too, settling around them like a living thing. It was almost as if the entire chamber was holding its breath. He took a step forward, slowly and carefully, not wanting to disrupt the delicate balance of the moment. As he approached, Cryana opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that sent a jolt through his chest. The world outside the chamber, the expectations of the Threnin delegation, and even the bond they had forged over the past weeks, all of it seemed to fade into the background. This was just them, standing together, on the precipice of something that neither of them could entirely understand but both knew they needed to experience. Mark reached out to touch her, his fingers lightly brushing the soft scales of her arm. The contact was electric, warmth, energy, a ripple of something far greater than the physical. With a sudden sharp intake of breath, Cryana stepped closer to him. Without a word, she guided his hands to her waist, pressing his palms firmly against her body. The heat of her skin radiated through him, a heat that was both foreign and intoxicating. Mark could feel the subtle tremors in her body, the tiny signs of anxiety hidden beneath her calm exterior. It was a vulnerability that only deepened his resolve. As they stood together, the air around them seemed to thicken, charged with anticipation. Mark felt the first pang of discomfort, an unfamiliar sensation that spread through his chest as though his very soul was being drawn into something beyond his comprehension. Cryana gasped, her eyes closing as the connection deepened. The pain came suddenly, sharper than he anticipated. It was an intense, almost primal force, both physical and emotional. He felt her suffering through their connection, felt the tension in her body as the ritual demanded more of them both. He had been prepared for it, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the overwhelming tide of sensation that crashed over him. He gritted his teeth, but Cryana's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the pain. "Do not pull away. Trust me." And with that simple command, Mark did as she asked. The pain, though sharp, became something they shared, something they would endure together. Slowly, the waves of agony ebbed, replaced by a strange warmth that seeped into his very bones. The connection deepened as the light in the chamber grew brighter, wrapping around them like a cocoon. In that moment, Mark understood. It wasn't just about surviving the ritual. It was about forging a connection, one that transcended the pain and the doubts, one that would bind them together in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. The true essence of the breeding pact was not the physical act. It was the shared strength in enduring it together. And in that shared strength, Mark realized with sudden clarity, there was no turning back. The pain had gradually faded, transforming into a strange, almost intoxicating warmth that filled every corner of Mark's mind and body. It was not just the physical sensations of the ritual, it was something deeper, something that seemed to resonate with his very soul. For a moment, the world outside the chamber ceased to exist. There were no political tensions, no expectations from the Threnan delegation, no doubts in the back of his mind. All that mattered was the presence of Cryana, and the bond they were forging in this sacred moment. Mark could feel the pulse of Cryana's breath against his chest, the subtle rise and fall of her body. It was a rhythm, a dance that they had entered into together, an ancient one passed down through the generations of her people. Her scales were warm beneath his hands, her body trembling slightly in the aftermath of their shared connection. He could feel her emotions, raw, open, vulnerable, and in return he offered her his own, everything he had to give. They stood together, eyes closed, allowing the chamber's energy to envelop them. Mark didn't know how long they remained that way, lost in the sensation of the bond that was slowly, irrevocably sealing itself between them. He had expected discomfort, uncertainty, but instead he felt something else entirely, a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. It was Cryana who broke the silence first, her voice barely more than a breath against his ear. "Do you feel it?" Mark opened his eyes and looked down at her. Her expression had softened, her face radiant in the light of the chamber. There was no doubt in her eyes now, no fear, no hesitation. Only the quiet certainty that they had done what needed to be done. "I do," he replied, his voice rough. "I feel everything." She smiled, the expression gentle but knowing. "It is the bond. It is not just the ritual. It is us, Mark. Together." He nodded slowly, understanding now what she meant. The pain they had endured, the ritual they had gone through, had not been something to fear. It had been a test, yes, but it was more than that. It was a powerful declaration of their union, not just as individuals, but as two beings from different worlds who had chosen to stand together despite the odds. And now, as the pain continued to dissipate, the warmth between them was undeniable. A sudden flare of energy from the chamber pulled Mark's attention back to their surroundings. The ethereal lights seemed to shift, glowing brighter, more intense. Cryana's markings had faded from the brilliant blue to a soft, almost imperceptible glow, signifying the completion of the ritual. The air around them hummed with the energy of their union, a resonance that seemed to permeate everything. "This is it," Cryana said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "The bond is complete." Mark took a step back, his hands still lightly resting on her waist, as he took in the full scope of what had just happened. He could feel the weight of it, something that would never be undone. He could also feel something else, something that wasn't just his own. Cryana's emotions, her thoughts, interwoven with his in ways he had never imagined possible. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was a melding of hearts and minds, a joining of spirits. "How do you feel?" Cryana asked, her eyes searching his face. Mark thought for a moment, feeling the subtle shifts in his own thoughts and emotions. It was as if his entire being had been rewired, reshaped by the ritual they had just completed. The intensity of the connection left him breathless, but it was not a burden. It was a strange kind of freedom, a release from the isolation he had always felt even among his own people. Cryanna's presence, both as a partner and as a member of her species, had filled a void he hadn't even known existed. "I feel like I've finally found where I belong," he said, his voice steady now but still filled with the wonder of what they had shared. "Like, everything makes sense. Like we've always been meant to be here." She smiled at him, and in her eyes he saw something powerful, a recognition of the same truth. They had crossed a threshold, one that could never be undone. In that moment, Mark realized that no matter what came next, no matter what challenges they faced from the Threnan people or anyone else, the bond they had created could not be broken. But their union would not be without its tests. Though they had sealed their connection, they were still an outsider couple, standing in defiance of the cultural and political forces that sought to tear them apart. Threnek had made it clear that they were still to be tested, that their bond would not be fully accepted until it was proven again in the eyes of the delegation. But for the first time since this journey had begun, Mark felt something other than doubt. He felt sure of himself, sure of them, and sure of their ability to face whatever challenges awaited. "We've made it this far," he said, looking down at her with a new sense of determination. "And we'll make it through the rest. Together." Cryanna reached up, placing her hands gently against his face. "Yes. Together." The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of calm and tension. The breeding pact had been completed, and while it had not yet been fully recognized by the Threnan delegation, the act itself spoke volumes. Mark and Cryanna were now bound in ways that transcended the political games, the tests, and the judgments of those who sought to separate them. They were united, not just by their connection but by their shared experience and their unwavering commitment to one another. But as much as Mark wanted to focus on the bond they had created, the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. Threnek, despite the ritual's success, had been watching them closely, his eyes always calculating, always weighing whether their union was truly worth supporting. The rest of the delegation was still skeptical, still unsure if this relationship between two vastly different species could ever truly hold. Yet, the mark of their union was undeniable now. The bond they had formed was visible not only to each other but to all who observed them. It had become a symbol not just of personal commitment, but of the potential for a new future. A future where the divide between human and Threnan could be bridged by something as profound as love and understanding. The next meeting with the Threnan delegation was scheduled soon, and Mark knew it would be the ultimate test of their union. This time it would not just be about surviving the ritual. It would be about proving that their bond was unbreakable, that it could withstand the harsh scrutiny of those who would try to tear them apart. But as Mark stood in the quiet of their shared quarters, Cryanna by his side, he felt ready. The connection they had forged was more than enough. No matter what Threnek or any of the elders might say, Mark knew that he and Cryanna had already proven the most important thing, that their bond was real. And nothing, no test, no challenge, could ever change that. "We'll face them," Cryanna said quietly, her voice filled with resolve, "as we faced everything else. Together." Mark smiled, feeling the unspoken power of their words settle over him. Together. And so, with that simple promise, they stepped forward, knowing that no matter what came next, they had already made history. You said. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.